I'm Ben Weingarten.
I'm Will Chamberlain.
I'm Amber Duke.
I'm Inez Stepman.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Well, as always, we've got a diverse and interesting array of topics to cover this week. Inez is going to kick us off by talking about the second assassination attempt, at least that we know of, on Donald Trump. I will talk a bit about the Department of Justice's targeting of those who would have the gall to seek to clean our voter rolls of non-citizens in particular. Will talk a little bit about the exploding Hezbollah devices, pagers, solar panels reportedly, and others in Lebanon ongoing right now. And then last but not least, Amber will take us home by talking a bit to ProPublica's fake abortion story and that Kamala Harris's campaign's efforts to exploit that story. So with that, let's kick it over to Inez first.
Yeah, this has amazingly already been kind of dropped out of the main headlines by the time we were recording on Thursday, which I think is a testament to the media. So we are starting with the biggest news, which is the second attempt on Donald Trump's life. This was a serious, equally serious, almost as equally serious attempt. There were no shots gotten off at Trump. In this case, the Secret Service shot first. So that's at least an improvement, minor improvement over last time. But the basic facts are that this guy, Ryan Ruth, 58, was able to set up camp in the bushes, the shrubbery on the Trump golf course. And Secret Service agents saw the muzzle of the gun peeking out of the bushes and went ahead and opened fire. There was some confusion initially about this story. Like the New York Post reported that there were shots exchanged sort of unrelated just near the golf course. That turned out not to be true. It turned out to be that this is a very serious assassination attempt. And then I can see why the story would be buried because there is this time a very clear ideological motive, right? I'm not saying this guy is not nuts. To some extent, you have to be a little bit nuts to do something like this, but he has a very clear ideological perspective expressed over time, in some cases even matching word for word the rhetoric of a lot of the top people in the Democratic Party, including Kamala Harris, right, about how Trump was a threat to democracy. Democracy is on the ballot, et cetera, et cetera. He also had very strong views on the Ukraine-Russia war. And this is somebody who was known, once again, his behavior had freaked out people in the past. There was a 2019 tip to the FBI about this guy. Cue the meme, say the line, right? He was on our radar. But I think this opens a series of questions beyond the obvious. One, apparently, one of the reasons he was able to get this far is because the golf course wasn't surrounded as it would be by Secret Service if Trump were quote unquote president, right? Instead of a candidate. So there's a question of why, we don't beef up Donald Trump's Secret Service security, given the fact this is the second attempt on his life. It seems like a very reasonable request on his part. And then there's, of course, the media response to this, which has largely been, well, it's kind of Donald Trump's fault that somebody wants to kill him. And I'm not exaggerating that they're pointing to Donald Trump turning up the rhetoric. Somehow the conversation in mainstream media after the second assassination attempt is not about, and I think Will had a great tweet about this, and hopefully he'll elaborate on it here, about the necessity of the conversation, national conversation that we're always having about the escalating rhetoric around Donald Trump and how that contributes to this kind of environment, dangerous environment. But not only are we not having that conversation, somehow the media discussion has been, well, Donald Trump riles people up, right? His skirt is too short. Donald Trump riles people up, and that's why people want to kill him. And it's just been like incredibly irresponsible. Everything around the way that the second assassination attempt, even as opposed to the first one, has been reported on and dealt with has been incredibly irresponsible. Just a continuation of essentially, the same kind of rhetoric that, quite frankly, does justify to create like the crazy people we know are out there right? That this is a righteous thing to do, that you're saving the country from the next Hitler. Like, let's be honest, this guy basically took seriously the rhetoric that the New York Times and Democrats are spewing every single day, which is that Donald Trump is an existential threat to the country, and that we're all going to be living in the Third Reich if he's allowed to proceed and indeed to win this election if he's able to. So, I don't know, there's a lot there to get into: security issues, media response, and then the biggest fundamental question, I mean, what do we do going forward? Because it seems like the bubble around the idea that it was very, very difficult to get a shot off at the president, or one of the presidential candidates, right? That seems to be a burst. And to me, it seems like there's been a big sign that's gone up all over the country to however many crazy people are out there, or are ruthlessly ideological enough to do this kind of evil act. You know, what do we do in the next few months? What is necessary? And then I guess any of that. So what we do for the next few months, media response, and security issues going forward with the Trump campaign and with Donald Trump.
I found myself sort of chuckling in the aftermath when everyone was praising the Secret Service for what a great job they did, when it turns out this guy was able to roam around the golf club for about 12 hours before Trump finally showed up to the fifth hole, and also admitted that the Secret Service had not swept the perimeter prior to Trump playing golf that day. So this is just another failure that this guy was able to get as close as he was. And that he was able to be set up in this sniper nest for as long as he was. This was not a victory by any measure. And then on the media side of this, even the White House and the Kamala Harris campaign and Kamala herself have taken to doing the victim blaming. Kamala did the National Association of Black Journalists interview 2 months after Trump did this week. And her reaction to being asked if she had trust in the Secret Service was to say, I feel safe, but people in Springfield, Ohio don't feel safe because of Trump talking about the strain that migrants have put on the local system there. And LGBTQ people don't feel safe in this country. So immediately twisting it around on Trump. And then the White House, Karine Jean-Pierre, the press secretary, was asked by Peter Doocy, you keep saying from this podium that people need to tone down their political rhetoric, and yet multiple times during this press briefing, you referred to the former president as a threat. What is it going to take for you to stop using that word? And her response was that it wasn't her problem, but actually Peter Doocy asking the question was what was dangerous. There's so many mental gymnastics that have taken place for them to continue to justify their claims that if you say something politically that they don't like, if some crazy person seizes on it and tries to kill somebody, it's Republicans' fault. It's never their fault, held to the same standard. So they have to still somehow make it Trump's fault in order to keep using that line of attack.
I just want to underscore the point about the portrayal that this is a success somehow. First of all, I mean, I shudder to think what failure looks like. Presumably it's Butler, but it obviously could be worse. And it's worth noting that it wasn't just kind of like the media mouthpieces who were portraying this as some kind of success. It was the acting Secret Service director. There was a dumbfounding press conference they gave, I believe, the day after the assassination plot was unearthed, where basically the acting Secret Service director was trumpeting this as a massive victory, total security success, and calling for more money from Congress. So just dumbfounding. I'd also note that the bottom line is that it's clear the Biden-Harris administration cannot or will not adequately protect Donald Trump. The FBI that is investigating this itself has been used as a political weapon against Donald Trump, even though Merrick Garland, and it's sort of an admission of guilt here. Merrick Garland says we're not going to use our authority as a political weapon, but it's clear they are. And it's worth noting that the main FBI official in charge on the ground of the investigation himself, according to whistleblowers, had tons of anti-Trump content on his social media that he had to scrub before FBI Director Wray promoted him to his current position. So Donald Trump won't be protected by his political opponents. The people investigating him hate his guts. And somehow we're supposed to expect that this man is going to be protected and that there's going to be a fulsome investigation on the ground here. I think it's a disgrace all around. Add on to it, of course, the media aspect. And I think we have to be careful always about the link between rhetoric on the one hand, incitement, and then action on the other hand, because, of course, the left is always going to use this as a cudgel against us. But it's very clear when you call the person Hitler every single day and you say he's going to do all these tyrannical things and destroy the country, the question for the left is what wouldn't you do to prevent this man from assuming the office? And I think it's very clear they're willing to abide almost anything. Last but not least, I would just make the point on the security issue. Based upon what we've seen, does anyone doubt that if there was a professional assassination effort, that it would not be successful based upon what we've seen? You know, this shooter, and we should definitely go down the rabbit hole at some point about his background and all the touch points he's had with authorities, beyond the criminal record, you know, his work in Ukraine, which had to have put him on the radar of U.S. authorities, and of course his interviews with the likes of the New York Times and elsewhere, maybe contra the background of Crooks, the Butler shooter. But does anyone have any doubts that a professional assassination attempt from a foreign security service wouldn't be successful based upon what we've seen? We're in a perilous position right now, less than 2 months out from an election, and every day you have to pray that there is not a successful assassination, I think, based upon what we've seen.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's this incredible contrast between the way the left treats this, like basically, you know, it's Trump's fault for using this rhetoric, blah, blah, blah. And then they go right around and turn around and blame Trump for bomb threats in Springfield, Ohio, because he had the audacity to point out that 20,000 Asian migrants are causing some interesting problems there. You know, and in particular, it's just, there was never any basis to connect those threats right off. And in fact, Mike DeWine went out and said that those threats came from a foreign country, and he won't even reveal which country it came from. So that's one of many problems. Yeah, I mean, Democrat rhetoric with regard to Trump has been irresponsible for a very, very long time. And you'd think after 2 assassination attempts in 2 months, there would be some thought about, hey, like, is this guy actually a danger to democracy? And I think, honestly, like, he was president for 4 years. Where was the dictatorship? Like, the one thing they can really object to is he didn't believe that the election results were legitimate and tried to stay in power. But like, if you actually looked at how he wielded the power he had, this was no dictatorship. And yet the rhetoric is just endlessly overblown. And they should really chill out. It'd be nice if we didn't have start a new tradition of presidential assassinations in this country.
Well, on that note, speaking of elections and probably efforts to try and chill speech around issues associated with elections, in a little noticed issuance of guidance, the DOJ set forth recently their view, supposedly non-binding view, on voter roll list maintenance efforts. And this is a little bit in the weeds, but essentially, of course, all states have voter rolls. The vast majority of states are subjected to the National Voter Registration Act, and that act requires states to engage in some sort of list maintenance, cleaning of the voter rolls. It's very vague and sort of broad on what those voter roll maintenance practices and processes look like, and it's more or less left to the states what they do to determine when voters should be taken off the rolls, either for moving, death, etc. Obviously, one of the issues that we've discussed before is the fact that non-citizens have been getting on voter rolls in the thousands in states across the country. And we've seen states engage in these list maintenance efforts to clean the rolls of thousands of non-citizens. Up against that backdrop, the DOJ recently issued this guidance listing all of the prohibitions or restrictions that they believe exist based upon their reading of the NVRA on list maintenance practices. So I highlighted this in a piece for the Federalist because I think it's illustrative of the posture of the Biden-Harris DOJ and the Biden-Harris administration towards election integrity, which is to say they want to restrict, first of all, the premise of the document is restricting efforts to clean the voter rolls, not allowing states to clean the voter rolls, or, as they reference in many instances in this guidance, third parties to work with the states on their list maintenance processes and practices and actually executing, identifying populations of people who should not be on the rolls, challenging them, and actually getting them removed in the run-up to an election. So one issue here is the very premise that they're talking about restrictions on voter roll cleanups, as opposed to the DOJ instructing states to engage in practices to clean the voter rolls now 2 months out from an election. Another aspect that they talk about in this guidance is the notion, and this is kind of the chilling effect of it, that they talk about the use of records that don't stand up to prescribed bounds that the DOJ sets forth, but that aren't in the NVRA, about what databases you can use or information you can or can't use to engage in challenges of voters. The DOJ says basically you can't use databases that we don't like to engage in these list maintenance practices, cross-referencing one database with the state voter rolls to figure out who should be removed from those rolls. And they essentially say that you could be engaging, if you're a state actor or a non-state actor advising a state, you could be engaged in discriminatory practices potentially if you use the wrong kind of database, an insufficient database in DOJ's eyes, to go about challenging the rolls. Now, what does the DOJ consider discriminatory? As Kristen Clark, the Assistant Attorney General in the Civil Rights Division, voting rights, who has voting rights under her purview, and who, by the way, allegedly perjured herself during the confirmation process, Kristen Clark has said that calling for a proof of birthplace or citizenship proof constitute discriminatory measures when it comes to someone being enabled to register to vote and be on the roll. So that is the posture of the Biden-Harris DOJ, and I think it speaks to their definition of discriminatory is not our definition of discriminatory. Last but not least, and this is something that I think is really worth highlighting, this guidance harps on the fact that there's sort of a 90-day cool-off period where states are not allowed under the NVRA to engage in systematic voter roll cleanups within 90 days of an election. This is sort of like the practice that the DOJ has not followed about not engaging in political targeting prosecutions within X days of federal elections. Same thing here. They say there's a 90-day period where you can't engage in systematic voter roll cleanups. What this suggests, though, is that if you had a mass of non-citizens register 89 days out from this election or 50 days out from this election and participate, you can't have a systematic cleaning of the voter rolls targeting those populations potentially based upon how the DOJ is interpreting the law. So all of this, I think, speaks to the broader issue of the Biden-Harris administration does not want non-citizens en masse removed from the voter rolls. They're already putting out and trying to chill extant challenges, some of them pending, regarding voter roll cleanup efforts. And I think it's a further chilling effort on the third-party groups, election integrity advocates who might work with the states to identify populations to be removed from the voter rolls. Part and parcel of a much broader effort the administration is engaged in to chill election integrity advocates, governmental and non-governmental. So I think it's worth highlighting, and I guess the question I'd pose to the group is, what do you think is going to happen to the integrity of our elections and legal challenges to those on the conservative side challenging the left when this is the DOJ that we have in place?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like they're telling on themselves. I think that's the big thing to understand. Like they're telling on themselves when they say stuff like, yes, you shouldn't, we don't want to clean up the voter rolls. It's the same thing with voter ID, right? They're like, oh, voter ID could reduce access. But in every direction, basically, if there is a measure that might reduce the incidence of fraud or decrease its probability or increase the chance that someone committing voter fraud might get caught, Democrats are opposed to it. And I think it's because even if they aren't participants in the fraud themselves actively, they sort of know in their gut that there are more Democrats committing fraud than Republicans with voter rolls and false votes, and therefore that measures that combat voter fraud will hurt them. And it's actually kind of disgusting. I mean, it means, all this talk about protecting democracy is just bogus as hell because they don't actually care about protecting democracy. They care about protecting their power.
Yeah, I want to maybe broaden the lens slightly from elections, although that is the most pressing function of this, and note all of the major changes that one would think would be not just legislation, but landmark legislation to change things like this, that have been done by essentially bureaucracies operating under the Civil Rights Act unilaterally. So obviously there's what Ben just pointed to. There's the changes to Title IX and Title VII, both where the word sex was redefined to include gender identity. To be clear, Democrats tried to include gender identity in civil rights protections. They have tried multiple times in Congress. That legislation has failed, but they've done it through bureaucracies, both through the EEOC for the workplace context, and then Title IX for the schools K-12 all the way through university context. They've altered constitutional rights in those contexts, like due process and free speech, with an expanding definition of harassment that has cut into what is clearly protected speech by the courts, right? So like there's the backstop in the case of due process and free speech in the courts, but what's happened is that these civil rights bureaucracies have essentially told employers, schools, and other institutions, no, you need to violate speech in order to be in compliance with the Civil Rights Act, right? So there are a lot of institutions responding to those incentives, especially when they're already inclined to ideologically, right? And it's having an enormous impact. Every one of those things that I just listed, I mean, it's having impact on like discipline in schools. There are many, many smaller examples of this, but there are essentially civil rights agencies and a whole series of departments in the federal government that have enormous power to unilaterally rewrite, I mean, like I said, not just legislation, things that would be like notable once in a decade, 20 years, 25 years, 50 years legislation, right? And they are doing it with no oversight whatsoever. And oftentimes they're not even going through the regulatory process to do it. They're just doing it by guidance and enforcement. So this is a problem. There's a larger problem, of course, with the administrative state being able to do this generally. There's a specific problem with the Civil Rights Act and some of these independent agencies that are kind of buried within other departments that are granted certain powers by the CRA. And they're going way beyond what's in the text on a regular basis on fundamental issues that really, really deserve a national conversation. So I hope that Republicans to some extent have found their balls on this issue and they're not just afraid of the word Civil Rights Act in order to actually address some of these issues, because what we're finding, and what Ben's topic is a great example of, is that almost everything can be folded into some imaginative interpretation of the Civil Rights Act by ideological bureaucrats, and it is very, very difficult to fight once they issue that guidance.
I won't add much here, but I think it's notable that as Ben, you've been reporting on the DOJ's reticence to take election integrity seriously. I think it was just 2 weeks ago that they had to reach a plea agreement with a woman who had stolen the identity of an American citizen and had used it to vote in elections in Alabama on, I think, 3 separate occasions. So the old tagline that election fraud doesn't happen, obviously it doesn't hold any water. And so if it happens, then why are we not addressing it and taking steps to ensure that it doesn't happen? And the answer, I think, as we've all gone through, is quite obvious.
On that note, let's transition to Will to talk about Hezbollah's exploding pagers.
Yeah, so I mean, if you've been paying attention to the news over the last 2 days, the biggest news has been this dramatic and staggering operation, most likely and almost certainly, I will say, carried out by the Mossad in Lebanon around 3:30 p.m. local time in Lebanon on Tuesday. Pagers started blowing up all over Beirut, southern Lebanon, and elsewhere, belonging to Hezbollah fighters. And there's a lot of speculation that somehow Israel hacked into them by, hacked into the battery and did some very complicated cyber operation. But really quickly, I figured it out. I'm just going to pat myself on the back. I immediately said that no, Mossad just sold some explosive pagers to Hezbollah. It's sort of a classic. This is actually something that's been done, not this particular style, but the idea of setting up an intelligence agency, setting up a front company to sell hacked into goods. It was done in The Wire, for example, if you're familiar with that television show. So I thought that was what happened. It was pretty clear that, these were actually small little bombs in people's pockets, and it wasn't just a battery going on fire. But the net effect of this is really dramatic. It's one of the most precise mass attacks that you can imagine. Hezbollah is embedded in the civilian population of Lebanon. They aren't wearing uniforms necessarily. And Hezbollah and Israel still found a way to target individual members of the group in this mass attack. And it's also remarkable because Hezbollah has been trying to improve its security. Nasrallah famously went on, one of his addresses, talked about how cell phones are terrible and everybody member of the organization needs to stop using cell phones because Israel's listening to your cell phones and they can track you. And, they thought that these low-tech pagers would be a way to solve the problem of Israel tracking them. Well, it turns out not if you buy the pagers from Mossad. If you buy the pagers from Mossad, that probably will defeat your efforts. I think, there are lots of arguments from various, like the Israel haters, especially like the international law Israel hater types, are trying to say this is a violation of international law. I don't know if there's ever been a more precise attack on an enemy population. Eugene Kontorovich had a good take, like sabotage is legal during war. There's a war. Hezbollah started firing rockets on October 8th. Not after Israel invaded Gaza, but the day after October 7th. So it's pretty clearly like a justified act. I think the really interesting question going forward is, will Israel end up taking advantage of this to invade southern Lebanon? Because Israel's big problem is 60,000, 70,000 people have been evacuated from northern Israeli cities and aren't able to go home because Hezbollah won't stop firing rockets at them. And there's no territorial dispute. This land is Israeli. Israel isn't invading Lebanon. So Hezbollah just keeps doing this, keeps violating Israeli sovereignty. I saw the PM of Lebanon get up today and have the chutzpah to say, oh gosh, this attack was a terrible violation of Lebanese sovereignty. It's like you let a terrorist organization take over the southern half of your country and rocket your neighbor. What do you think is going to happen eventually? So I don't know what you guys all think about this. I think it's super cool. Basically anytime any one of these AOC or anybody talks about how terrible a violation of this, somebody just ask them to check their pager.
Yeah, at some point, the relevant moral question is, especially for people who are fence sitting on this rhetorically, not with action, but fence sitting rhetorically, like Kamala Harris, is you say that Israel has a right to defend itself. What would that look like for you, where you would not find it disproportionate, immoral, terrorist acts, whatever, right? Because this is very proportional, extremely targeted, right? As Will pointed out, this is about as low a civilian casualty rate as one can get if you're targeting an enemy force, because of the let's be honest, the cool nature of how they did it, right? Which apparently this buy happened in 2022. So it just begs the question, right? It's obvious at some point that the problem is who is doing the defending and not how they're going about doing it. And I think this attack makes that extremely clear in terms of the response from the Democrats. And I want to just underscore what Will said about a lot of people being evacuated from their homes. Israel is a very small country. I think it's around 10 million, right? That's a little bit bigger than the New York metro area in terms of population. People are displaced and economically unable to do their work. And it's a big deal, but it's just something that's ongoing. We hear a lot about refugees, right, in this crisis. Well, they're being taken care of, but there are refugees from their homes in the entire part of northern Israel. They can't return home because of this. So, yeah, the big question is this a prelude to a larger war? Certainly it would be a good first volley on the part of Israel to scramble and make impossible communications among all of Hezbollah's top staff and all of their sort of command structure. Maybe I guess we'll have to see, but independently, this is both obviously extremely meme worthy, and there's a lot of funny stuff about it online, but also just fundamentally, this is a spectacular execution of an operation that targets exactly the people who have been making war against you, with very limited external casualties beyond that. I'm not saying none, because every attack has something and we don't really know yet with this, but this is an extremely targeted attack, and it's a clever one, and I think it deserves to be applauded.
Yeah, I saw a lot of pro-Palestinian propagandists going on and on about the fact that one of the children of one of the Hezbollah terrorists had allegedly been killed as a bystander in one of the pager explosions. And there didn't seem to be any acknowledgement that when you engage in terror, unfortunately, it can possibly put your family at risk. It's like blaming the person who locks up a drug dealer for taking him away from his family rather than the actions of the drug dealer. And of course, that's not even to mention the number of children in Israel who have died due to attacks from Hamas and Hezbollah rockets. So there's a massive warping of the reality of the situation by people who have gotten very, very good at a PR strategy to try to get sympathy for their side.
Yeah, just interject with one point, because you reminded me, Amber. Hezbollah, these fighters are raining indiscriminately rockets on civilian centers, including the rocket that killed 12 children in Israel. So like this is again an extremely targeted strike at people who are not just, we forget the seriousness of lobbing rockets at Israel because they have Iron Dome and are able to catch a high percentage of them before they hit the ground, but they do hit the ground, they do kill people. And fundamentally, this is a terrorist group that is breaching the borders of a sovereign country with hundreds and thousands often of rockets that are deadly. Like that's an act of war in any kind of situation. There's almost, I don't even like sort of explaining this in a certain way, because it's so clear that the people engaging on this are doing it in bad faith, that there is no possible response that Israel could make to these actions that would be deemed morally acceptable by the people who are criticizing them. But I mean, this is a particularly clear example of that.
At the end of the day, on the propaganda aspect, ultimately, the only thing that Israel can do that will satisfy its critics is to destroy itself, allow itself to be destroyed, engage in suicidal policies, not defend itself, at very best, engage in some sort of diplomatic solution that ultimately will lead to its own destruction. And so responding with force is the only moral thing, it's the only right thing that the nation can do. And I want to point out one of the perverse aspects of this. It's definitely worth harping on the fact that there have been tens of thousands of refugees in Israel since October 7th, and not just from the areas near Gaza, but from the north. Let's not forget the Biden-Harris administration prevented Israel from striking Hezbollah decisively in a surprise attack immediately after October 7th. The Biden-Harris administration has been seeking to force a quote-unquote diplomatic resolution to issues around where Hezbollah forces are operating in Lebanon and to Israel's north that have rendered the north uninhabitable for tens of thousands of Israelis. A diplomatic solution that, like the quote-unquote maritime deal that the Biden administration imposed on Israel with Lebanon prior, was a strategically disastrous and would be a strategically disastrous deal that would make Israel, again, indefensible, undefendable in the north. The New York Times did a profile on Amos Hochstein, who part of his portfolio is serving as sort of an envoy for the Biden-Harris administration, working with the Lebanese and working with Israel and trying to negotiate something for months here. And they talk about how he walks freely in Hezbollah-controlled territory, not a care in the world, within Lebanon. How perverse is that we are so in bed with Hezbollah effectively that we're trumpeting that in the New York Times? That's basically what the State Department and the Biden administration is doing. And let's also not forget that Lebanon is basically a Hezbollah-controlled country, and U.S. administrations, Republican and Democrat, have been pumping billions of dollars in to the Lebanese military, which in effect is an adjunct of Hezbollah and ultimately is serving alongside Hezbollah. So once again, the U.S. has been put on the side of Iran-backed proxies against Israel, and Israel was left undefended in the north, so it had to remove its citizens from there, prevented from the Biden administration from striking back decisively. And the question now, to Inez's point, is going to be, is this a precursor to a much more substantial and decisive onslaught against Hezbollah, or is this a threat and a warning, albeit a powerful one? And I guess we'll have to see how that plays out in the days ahead. I've seen some reporting today, and we're recording this Thursday, to suggest that there's a much more substantial attack from Israel coming, but we'll have to see how it plays out. And on that note, we'll transition to a totally different subject, where Amber will take us home talking about this fake abortion story and the Harris-Walz campaign's efforts to exploit it.
Yes, thank you, Ben. This is unfortunately the latest in a long line of these types of stories where the left has tried to shift their messaging away from abortion as a matter of birth control and abortion as a matter of health care. So they've trotted out a number of women, including multiple on the Democratic National Convention stage in Chicago, claiming that their lives were in danger because they were not able to get quote unquote abortion care while suffering miscarriages, which to start is just a lie. There's not a single state in the United States that prevents treatment for a miscarriage, also known as a spontaneous abortion in medical speak. Any doctor who suggests otherwise or chooses not to treat a woman because they are supposedly afraid of being prosecuted under a pro-life law is trying to score political points. That's just the reality of what's happening here. So there's an article that came out this week from ProPublica where they claim to have found the first example of a woman dying from an abortion ban. This is in Georgia. And this woman, according to the article, was delayed getting a DNC, which is a procedure that basically removes deceased fetal tissue out of a woman's womb, and ended up dying from sepsis. And the implication was that because Georgia bans abortions after 6 weeks, the doctors didn't want to give her the DNC because they were worried about the pro-life law. Again, DNC is different from an abortion. It's sometimes part of a surgical abortion, but when used to treat a miscarriage or to remove tissue is not classified as one by any means, and would have nothing to do with Georgia's abortion law. You read through the ProPublica article, though, and you quickly find out that this woman was not actually having a miscarriage. She was having a failed abortion. She had actually traveled to North Carolina, I believe, because she was past the 6-week mark and got an abortion pill to get rid of the twins that she was carrying. And this was someone who was already a mother and decided basically that twins was too much work for her to take care of. So she wanted to get this abortion pill. She ended up having side effects, which are not as uncommon as the left would have you believe. These abortion pills, their safety and efficacy was recently debated through the courts. The Supreme Court ultimately ruled that the plaintiffs did not have standing. So they didn't really address the fact that the FDA has consistently provided smoke screens about the safety of abortion pills. So she has these side effects. She's basically bleeding out and suffering from an infection. She goes into the emergency room. They try to treat her multiple times with antibiotics and fluids and kind of a wait and see. And eventually her situation becomes so severe that they give her the DNC, but it is too late and she dies from sepsis. There's no indication or evidence in either her medical records, her family's recounting of events, the doctors who treated her. There's only some anonymous quotes from people who did not treat this woman and aren't even abortion providers or medical providers in Georgia, suggesting that this was because of Georgia's pro-life law and that the doctors must have delayed the DNC because they were worried about legal ramifications. Again, there's zero evidence of this. This is entirely rank speculation. I mean, at best, you can say that they were negligent in waiting so long to provide the DNC. But again, there's no demonstrated link whatsoever to the Georgia abortion law. But Kamala Harris and the Harris-Walz campaign immediately seized on this story, saying that it was proof that Donald Trump is going to cause women to die if he gets into office because he wants abortion to be relegated by the states. And some states like Georgia might have more restrictive laws on abortion than other states. We also saw the Harris campaign in a phone call this week for press their campaign manager, Julie Chavez Rodriguez, claiming that Trump's official platform, meaning Agenda 47, will ban IVF and abortion federally, which is just obviously 100% of a lie. His platform is very clear that he wants to protect IVF, separate from whatever moral or ethical considerations we might have on that issue, that he wants to protect IVF and wants abortion to be decided by the states, and that he would not pass any sort of federal law related to abortion. So this is an issue that usually ranks around 5th or 6th for voters. So it's obviously not as salient as economy, immigration, crime, foreign policy, but it is one that matters to Democrats and independent voters. And I think Republicans need to figure out how to respond to these attacks in a way that makes clear they know what they're talking about. I think too often the Republicans and conservatives, outside of really embedded pro-life activists, just find themselves completely flat-footed as the left just wantonly lies about their positions on this and about what this actually means for women. And with that, I'll let the group weigh in.
Yeah, I agree with you, Amber, that there is no clear message at all from the Trump campaign, which obviously they don't want to take the pro-life, like traditional Republican line. And I mean, I guess that's understandable politically. And also because, I mean, obviously Trump doesn't have deep personal feelings on this issue. He picked it up as an issue to prove his bona fides to essentially like conservative voters in 2015 and 2016. But they need to figure out what his line is, because during the debate, it was kind of all over the place. It was pinging around in that section kind of wildly. And I think that does give people the impression that he's not being honest about it, or that like he doesn't want to say what he really thinks. And I think the reality is he doesn't know what he thinks, but that's just my speculation. But in terms of how these stories have been covered, I just want to draw a parallel to the cats and dogs story that Trump brought up on the debate stage, right? There are multiple reports that have been made to police and have been made like publicly. There's no confirmation, as I understand it, of any one of those reports, but there are multiple reports. So you have essentially a story to be investigated, right? But no indication that there's anything untrue about the story. There's no disproof of the story. There's no contravening facts of the story. It's just a series of allegations. And that's, as JD Vance has pointed out in interviews, that's media's job, is to go and investigate when you have a bunch of people saying something. You know, maybe it's true, maybe it isn't. There's plenty of things that circulate on the internet that are not true, right? There are plenty of things that have reports that are not true, but that is in fact the function of the media, to go and investigate unconfirmed reports, right? And by doing more than picking up the phone and calling somebody with a vested interest in it in the city government, right? So that's how that story has been treated, with just absolute disdain, and to the point of like lying about what JD Vance says in interviews, where they seized upon it something that he very clearly in the next sentence disavows, which is they say that he made up the story. But what he was talking about was the media coverage. He has to create the story, meaning the media coverage. And in the very next sentence, he clarifies himself and says, I'm not talking about the underlying thing. I'm talking about your coverage of this story and of the problems in Springfield. And of course, the way that was run with from everyone from Kamala Harris to Gavin Newsom, right, was dishonest. I just want to compare all of that to this story, where there was an investigation. There are key facts that are contradictory to the way that the story is being used, again, by the Harris campaign itself. So this goes right up to the principal level, right? This is not just like people online using this story. And there are key facts that are not just unconfirmed, but are confirmed in the opposite direction, right? This story is false as it is being used by the Harris campaign, just on baldly, objectively false. And that's true whether, you know, however you feel about abortion, whatever it is. But this story itself is false. And yet we don't have like, you know, an enormous rending of the garments, like especially on our own side, by the way, about this story with the cats and dogs. So rending of the garments and feeling like oh, like this is illegitimate politics in some way, right? I think that's a really instructive contrast. They're taking something that is they know to be false, has actual confirmed contradictory facts, versus just looking into and highlighting politically into a bigger story an unconfirmed series of reports from, in JD Vance's case, constituents, and in Trump's case, right, people whose votes he wants, right? Like the way those two stories are treated just from an apolitical objective level, I think tells us so much about the two campaigns, about the media, about the entire frame of the election, honestly. And about the instincts of both sides, right? Like the instincts of the left versus the instincts of the right on this, to like circle up the firing squad and criticize our own.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the best takeaway is just, and it's a consistent thing where it's like, and conservatives, especially, God, some of the weaker conservatives who are getting on Trump and Vance over the stuff in Springfield, Ohio, and then not even blinking as like Democrats just completely make up a story about a woman dying of lack of abortion care. Just made it up out of whole cloth, and like the media doesn't care, the debate moderators didn't care. I mean, you name it. It goes to the heart of what's so stupid about this. And I do think in some sense the one white pill here is that I think Kamala realizes the campaign's not going for well, and there aren't many issues that she's winning over the American people on. And one of the few ones where they feel like they have a polling advantage is abortion. So they're trying to make it as salient as possible. And to do that, they need to make stories up because it really isn't that salient for most people, because these stories about like people being denied abortion care, like even under heartbeat laws, the current heartbeat laws have, the exceptions in place for rape, incest, life of the mother. So they really just don't have a lot of traction with the hard cases, or they shouldn't, and so they have to make something up.
I concur. It's all about trying to juice the voting constituency that they already have sewn up, but it's not clear at all that they can actually appeal on any issues beyond what appeals to the progressive base at the end of the day. So I guess we'll see ultimately if that strategy, plus the basement strategy, which Axios itself actually was touting today, ultimately prevails. On that note, we'll go to final thoughts, and I'll use executive privilege to kick us off to just highlight briefly a story, I guess maybe tangentially related to the Hezbollah beeper story, which was this week there was a State Department, I believe, Inspector General report circulated on the Hill showing that the State Department essentially allowed Rob Malley, who was the former Iran envoy, he was the chief negotiator of Iran Deal 1.0, and he tried to resurrect it for the Biden-Harris administration, someone with massive ties to individuals associated with what's been exposed to be an Iranian influence effort in the U.S., including one person associated with it who he brought into the State Department and who now works in a very sensitive position at the Pentagon. Malley himself was sidelined and suspended, frozen out, and put under investigation by State Department and then also by the FBI over his alleged mishandling of classified information, sensitive information that may have been shared with Iranian agents of influence, if not Iranian government officials. There was subsequent reporting showing that potentially his device or communications may have been compromised, as well as potentially other people within the State Department as well. So a potentially massive security breach associated with an individual engaging at the highest levels in negotiations with Iran on behalf of the Biden administration. We found out in this, according to reporting on the State Department internal review, that State Department officials continued to allow Malley to engage with sensitive information, to participate in meetings with administration officials, all after he may have been compromised or engaged in compromising acts and should have been suspended and completely shut off from government communications and government interactions. This begs the question, is the blame now being placed on the State Department aimed at deflecting from Robert Malley's potential role in essentially an Iranian influence effort and or engaging with Iranian officials in a way that undermined the U.S.? Also, did he get potentially special treatment in effect from the State Department because He is close friends dating back to boyhood and as a schoolmate of Secretary of State Antony Blinken when they grew up together in France for part of their respective childhoods. But also, I think the broader effort to memory hole and cover up everything around l'affaire Robert Malley, I think, is about covering up the Biden-Harris administration's treacherous dealings with Iran from day one. And that's why they want to kill the Malley story. And that might also explain this reporting, which may be a head fake, although legitimate, about the effective special treatment and brazen security failures that the State Department engaged in not fully freezing out Rob Malley. So a story that will probably be off the radar of much of the media, but a story that I think is illustrative of the disastrous Iran first policy that the administration has engaged in and the imperative it feels, I think, to cover it up.
I'll jump in here and just briefly add two unrelated points that just didn't fit in earlier. One, when we talked about the assassination and the potential investigation now and the conflict with having a DOJ that is prosecuting Trump, also investigating this assassination attempt. Fortunately, the governor in Florida, Ron DeSantis, is going to do an independent investigation into state crimes that could actually give us some information and at least some I guess some counter to that there will be people looking into this assassination attempt and Ruth who are not like invested in getting Donald Trump. So I think that's an important thing to note, an important thing to watch. The second thing is just briefly Independent Women's Voice, which is the C4 arm of the Independent Women's Forum where I work. We've launched a scorecard with Riley Gaines called the Stand With Women scorecard. I just wanted to highlight that because I think so few people understand, like it's such a basic thing about men and women's sports. I mean, it does make one think like we really must have our backs against the wall if we have to defend something like this, right? The most obvious differences between the sexes. But it has been amazing how Democrats vote in lockstep on this. You would think that given the position of moderates on this issue, which is overwhelmingly against males participating in women's sports for obvious reasons. Not only are moderates and the general public against this, they're moving further conservative, right? So if you look at polls 2 years ago, there are higher percentages of people who say that men should not participate in women's sports. And I'm phrasing it that way for clarity, but that's not the way the polls phrase it. It's about, transgender identified or whatever it is. So I think the scorecard is going to be super helpful in highlighting the unfortunate fact that the Democratic Party is basically in lockstep on this, which is, I think is worth pointing out, especially given how many times we're always told like, oh, like the Republican Party needs to moderate and there are issues the Republican Party is out of step with the public on, for example, abortion, right? Here is an issue where the Democratic Party is massively out of step. And here they are marching in uniform lockstep with very, very few exceptions. They will vote against every single bill on the state and the federal level, every attempt to prevent males from participating in women's sports, something that basic, even though they only have about a quarter of the population in polls with them. I think that's worth pointing out for the general dynamics and to highlight IWV's Stand With Women scorecard. So that's my final thought.
I'll jump in and mention that the Teamsters Union has declined to endorse Kamala Harris. It's the first time they have not endorsed a Democrat in like 50 or 60 years, I think, maybe longer. And what was interesting about their explanation, so they polled their members and found that a majority support Trump. But they said that their standard for endorsing Kamala was if the majority of their membership supported her, they would endorse her. But if they were to endorse Trump, they would need unanimous support from their members. So there was a different little standard there for each candidate in terms of whether or not they would endorse. But I think this is a big cultural moment. I mean, we've known since Trump entered the race in 2015 that he was doing really well with union members. There's been a growing chasm politically between union leadership and union members. This is a confirmation of that trend, and it should also be a big moment of panic for the Democratic Party that they got rid of really one of their last candidates who has some credibility with union membership, who was Joe Biden. And they did this under the false impression that Kamala would perform better than him in some of these key groups that Democrats need to win the election. And she's basically shedded that union support. And they're going to have to find some other equally politically active and politically important demographics to make up for it. So far, it doesn't seem like she's had the ability to be a particularly inspiring leader that can do that. So this should be a big, big warning sign for the Democrats.
Yeah, I'll just make it really quick. You should check out the interviews that Jonathan Conricus has been giving. He's been absolutely on point. And if you don't also listen to the Call Me Back podcast for stuff on Israel, I think it's extraordinarily helpful. But I don't really have a final thought policy-wise. The big two topics I wanted to talk about were the assassination attempt and the pager thing. So I'm good.
On that note, on behalf of Amber, Inez, and Will, thanks for tuning in. I'm Ben Weingarten, and we'll see you at the next NatCon Squad.